And there are 6 states that require photo ID. Okay.
Right. Yes.
And not only is it free there, but there was increased voter turnout. So, for example, one of the longest-standing states with photo ID, Indiana. I bring this because it's in my memory because a girl before you brought up Indiana. Indiana, they saw like a 30% increased turnout rate for Barack Obama. It was the first time in decades that it went blue. Mm-hmm. And it actually increased turnout voter ID. And so what I'm saying is when you look at these statistics...
Is that correlation or causation?
Because Barack Obama inspired people to vote?
Yes.
Yeah. No, but the point is there was an increased turnout in Indiana, a state that has historically been red, right, once they had implemented voter ID laws. And this happened. There's still data coming out. I don't have all these numbers, I'll be honest with you, because they're not available, but it seems to be that voter identification actually is a net neutral or maybe a net positive in increasing voter turnout, which to me was very interesting. Now, when we talk about the poverty issue, here's the thing. The overwhelming majority of black Americans have ID. Okay, the low number is 85, the high number is 89.
89, okay.
Let's say it's 85.
I've heard about 20% of African Americans don't have ID.
Yeah, that's inaccurate. As a matter of fact, that came from one Washington Post study, which actually, I believe her name was Isabella, talked about before you were here, and that was actually rebutted by Stanford, because what had happened was they took, the only study people can point to, is they had taken people...
They like called people or whatever, and they were like...
Well, what happened was they didn't differentiate for states that had just incorporated new identification laws and lumped them in together, and then once you looked at states that had actually had voter ID laws in the books for a long time, really it was actually, they were sort of making an inference based on the amount of people who voted and sort of correlating that with voter ID. All of the subsequent studies have shown that it's a net neutral. It may increase white voter turnout during primaries. Mm-hmm. But I think we'd both agree that could be, is it correlation or causation? Because typically old white people are probably most likely to vote in the primary.
Yeah, okay, so...
So most black Americans have ID, but what's also interesting to me is the overwhelming majority of black Americans support requiring ID to vote. 73%.
73%.
Say, not only 73%, so there was a 69% poll, and there was just recently a 73% poll coming from Rasmussen.
Rasmussen? Oh, yes. Okay. I want to go back to your Indiana thing where...
But does that surprise you, though?
I'm going to have to look into it, I'm going to be honest.
Okay. Let's assume, so we post all these available online.
Yes.
Let's assume I'm not lying to you.
Yes.
Doesn't that matter if, in other words, because for me, this is my concern, okay? My concern is about ensuring the integrity of our elections, the legitimacy. And so for me, I think the only way to protect our 15th Amendment rights, right, the right to vote, and it shouldn't be infringed, is to ensure that no legitimate vote is wiped out by an illegitimate vote.
Okay.
And so it seems that that's also a primary concern of black Americans.
Yes.
Or think about it, if you were generationally oppressed and you weren't able to vote in the 60s, like you said, and now you say, okay, have the ability to vote, but you now have millions upon millions of undocumented immigrants who can vote without any identification, that's a huge cause of concern for the black community.
Okay.
And it's a huge cause of concern for the legal Latino immigrant community.
Yeah.
Over 80% of Latino Americans support requiring ID to vote.
I agree that this is coming from a place of patriotism, which I appreciate. So I'm kind of curious. So like, what type of sorry, I'm drawing a blank right now.
Penis. Tom Hanks.
I think you're onto something here.
Was it voter penis?
It was voter penis.
I'm sorry, I'm a child.
No, understandable. I feel the same way. Voter
suppression?
So, yeah, no.
Voter identification?
Gosh, I'm totally drawing a blank right now. This happens to me all the time.
It happens to me too.
What is it?
So do you want me to go back through what I was saying, or do you think it'll help jog you a little bit, where I said the overwhelming...
Where you lie when you're voting. I'm totally...
voter fraud?
Voter fraud. Okay, yeah, sorry. What type of voter fraud are voter IDs trying to suppress?
So I didn't say voter fraud. And this is something that, of course, is a hot button issue, which I'm sure you would disagree with. You're actually banned from YouTube, or so if you even mention voter fraud. You're not even allowed to talk about it.
I'm familiar with what's going on right now, man.
Which I'm sure, whether you think there has been voter fraud or not, we shouldn't live in a totalitarian state where people can't discuss the issue. No, my issue is not voter fraud, but it is voting system errors and anomalies. So the big outrage now, for example, is some kind of photo identification through the process of mail-in ballots, which, keep in mind, every other major industrialized country requires photo ID, and many non-industrialized countries. Can you vote without a photo ID in Mexico? Nope. Can you vote without a photo ID in Norway? Nope. Finland, nicest people in the world? Nope. El Salvador? Nope. And same thing if you look at a lot of these, France? Nope. They actually require ID and a specific reason for mail-in voting, because for the same reason that Elizabeth Warren, Amy Klobuchar, Jimmy Carter, Bernie Sanders have said that election integrity is our biggest national security threat, is that there would be no way to track votes. It is a serious problem if you have mass mail-in voting. That is where you are more likely to have broken system errors along with fraud. I'm not saying that the ghost of Hugo Chavez was scribbling, Dominion machine code. I'm saying that voting system anomalies have happened to the tune of millions in the country.
So how exactly are voter IDs, how are exactly our voter IDs combating this?
So it's a first step. I think first off, I think it's important to note that we don't want to go with a reverse nirvana fallacy, like, well, maybe it doesn't work, so let's not have any verification system, which is kind of what we have now. So it seems like we're both agreeing you need some kind of a verification system.
Okay, sure.
Are we both agreeing with that? Like, there needs to be a way to verify that voters are who they say they are.
Of course.
Okay.
Yes.
And I'm just saying that the best first step is a government-issued ID, because that step requires that like you said, go in with your social security number, usually a piece of mail. It's a process that's established, and it makes sure that you're not, for example, like in New York, they had up to 250,000. This is pre-2020, to 250,000 votes that they said could be using fake social security numbers, so they couldn't add up. They had to reject hundreds of thousands of ballots across California, North Carolina, Pennsylvania, because some of these places didn't have the proper vote identification. So I think it's a start. I think you need voter identification when you vote at the polls. And I also think that we need people to go through a process where voter identification is verified for mail-in voting.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
Do you think that's reasonable?
Yes, I do think that's reasonable. At the same time, I think it just... Sorry, I'm just drawing...
No, it's okay.
I'm a bit unfamiliar with how voter IDs, what's the difference between presenting voter IDs in the polls and presenting voter IDs? Like, how exactly are you going to verify that
for like mail-in
voting?
So you would have to go in and request a mail-in ballot, right? Different states might have different processes, but the point is there would be some point in that chain of command where a photo identification would be required. So let me give you an example. With me personally, I had left Michigan. I had changed my address.
Right.
I was sent a ballot that could have been filled out in Michigan. No idea if it was or not. I assume it wasn't.
Yeah.
But nowhere in that chain of custody, right, is a photo identification required. And I'm not saying that individuals are doing that, but I think we would both agree that those in the most elite positions of government don't always have our best interests at heart. And so
Tell me about it.
So my issue, and I think the same issue with Black Americans, is we need fail-safes against people in positions of power, making it easier for us to be incapable of tracking votes. Like a lot of times people say, well, there's no example of voter fraud or well, first off, there are plenty of examples of voter anomalies. When people say there's no example of voter fraud, like, in other words, if someone doesn't have photo ID that confirms who you, how would you ever have evidence of it? If you don't require ID, it's like saying, we don't have any evidence that any underage people have ever consumed alcohol, but the law across the land is you don't need to present ID for alcohol. Well, we'd never have evidence, would we?
Right, yeah. I think, I'm sure there are obviously we could do better as a country in improving voter ID regulations. I think accessibility is my main concern.
Right.
And I think, obviously, I don't think we're going to agree with this.
I don't think we'll agree on that, but I do appreciate you coming from a place that's genuine. I hope that you understand that I do.
Yes.
And I think where the difference is, where we line up a little bit differently, and I would ask that you permit for some understanding as to why, for example, the majority of Black and Latino Americans support voter identification, is because I think a lot of people in this country, particularly Blacks and Latino Americans, are concerned with ensuring the legitimacy of their ballot, not with accessibility for people who can't be bothered to get ID.
Right.
Minorities in this country do not feel like it is an infringement on their right to present basic identification, but they are concerned with having no system of identification wiping out their vote, because if you're a Black American today, if you're a Latino American, a legal immigrant here who came from one of these South American countries, you want your vote to count.
Right.